Will there be a war in Ukraine? Whole world is wondering about this one right now, given all the news coverage of it. It seemed like it was imminent, then it wasn't, then it was backing down. But is it? Our friend Nolan Peterson is with us now. He is a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces. He's now a journalist in Ukraine. He joins us from on the ground in that country, and he is a correspondent for Coffee or Die magazine. Nolan, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Just, you got to tell us, man, what is the state of play right now? Because a couple of days ago, news reports in the U.S. were going to be an invasion Wednesday. As of yesterday, it was actually Putin's moving away from it. Looks like there's not going to be a war. What's happening in Ukraine?
Right. So after months of a buildup, Russia now has enough military firepower on Ukraine's borders to execute sort of the worst case scenario, which is a countrywide invasion, possibly encirclement of Kyiv, most likely preceded by waves of airstrikes and missile attacks to, inflict massive casualties on Ukraine's military right off the bat, like a Desert Storm type conflict is what we're looking at. The U.S. intelligence community, I think, determined, based on whatever intelligence they have available, that by today, Russia was ready to attack. Whether or not today was D-Day or not, I don't think anybody knows, but today is the day that they are capable of executing the attack. There have been reports from Moscow that they had started to pull back some troops. But today, NATO, the U.S., and multiple open source intelligence observers noted that Russia is actually increasing its military forces around Ukraine. So I think, we are in the danger period right now. The build-up phase of this is over. The waiting game has begun. And so now Russia's tactic, effectively, is to just cloud the information space, with as much confusion as possible to make us not know what's coming next and to make us second-guess our assumptions, and also to, have the element of surprise. We know that they are poised to attack. We do not know when. There is, of course, always the possibility that Putin could walk this back and decide to change course. But at the moment, we have to take this deadly seriously because Russia does have the firepower in place to execute what would effectively be the largest land invasion in Europe since World War II.
Nolan, when I think about living in Ukraine, I can't imagine what it feels like to have this potentially hanging over your head. What does it feel like in Kiev and throughout Ukraine as the possibility of this invasion looms? What is it like in the streets? What does it feel like among the populace? What are you seeing? Is there a palpable fear, or do people seem to believe it's not going to happen?
Yeah, so an analogy I've used quite often recently is that I grew up in Florida, and this really reminds me of those days right before a major hurricane's about to hit, where you're trying to decide, do I stay? Do I flee? What do I do? Do I go out and buy a bunch of canned food? Do I fill the bathtub up with water? Like, people are trying to make these decisions, and, it's surreal. I watched the movie Schindler's List last night, and I feel like we're living through this moment that it just can't believe that this is happening in 2022. Here, a European capital, some 3 to 4 million families are making decisions like, do I become a refugee in the middle of winter? Do I stay put and ride out a potential Russian bombing attack? Or many people have decided to take up arms and potentially fight should Russia invade. So it's really, just an extraordinary moment. You see life basically going on as normal here in Kyiv. I mean, what choice do people have but to go on about their lives? And I think that many Western journalists get it wrong a little bit when they see life going on. They think, the people here don't take it seriously. But remember, this country has been at war for 8 years already. Russia invaded this country in 2014. So the people here, they're a little bit desensitized, I'd say, to the threat of violence because they've lived with the war in their country now since 2014. And, as an American, I can say, too, that the Ukrainian culture is not a culture where they wear their emotions on their sleeves like we do in America. And so their stoic nature as they endure this very tough situation is quite impressive. And I have to say, too, the way civil society is stepping up and preparing civilians for the war is amazing. You see a nation of people who are not waiting for their government to save them. And as an American, especially an American veteran, I have to say I'm quite impressed and inspired by what I've been seeing here in Ukraine recently.
Nolan, we're speaking to Nolan Peterson. He is on the ground in the capital of Ukraine, in Kiev, and as he says, the calm before what may be the storm of a major Russian invasion. Maybe. We don't know. Nolan, to that point, what would Putin possibly get out of this such that it would have been worth it to gather, over 130,000 troops, a preparation for really a three-pronged invasion if he wants it, and then nothing? What could he get? What is the prize that would keep him from going in?
Right. So I think right now, if somebody subscribes to the notion this is all bluff, I would say, what has he achieved at this point to justify his bluff, right? NATO is certainly more united. Ukraine has been receiving waves of weapons from its Western partners, and the Ukrainian people they are resolutely, steadfast in their commitment to democracy and their Western trajectory away from Russia. So I'd say that Russia, besides creating chaos, has really achieved nothing. There's all these speculations about what this attack will look like, right? Whether it's going to be another so-called hybrid war or a land bridge to Crimea or whatnot. And I have a bit more pessimistic viewpoint because I think that, Russia, or the Kremlin, isn't looking for a land bridge to Crimea. They're not looking for another gray zone war. They're looking to fundamentally reverse Ukraine's trajectory toward the West. And if that's Moscow's goal, then they're not going to achieve that with some little green men attack in the east. That will require an attack on Kyiv to change the government. And so I think that's why we should be really concerned, because Moscow's intent here is to fundamentally reverse Ukraine's Western trajectory. And so that, I think, telegraphs the type of conflict we're looking at. And that maximalist aim certainly signals a very, very significant military action.
Nolan, how will the Ukrainian people react? Not only the military, you mentioned sort of a Gulf War style invasion. What we saw in Iraq was many of the soldiers basically threw down their weapons and refused to do the battle for Saddam Hussein. How committed do you think the Ukrainian people are to resisting this Russian attack in the event it comes?
Well, that's a good point. And I think, as an American veteran who I served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, where we were prodding societies to embrace the notion of democracy, right? But this is a country that chose democracy on their own 8 years ago. And they have fought tooth and nail for the last 8 years to keep those dreams alive. They're not fighting in Ukraine. They have not fought for the past 8 years in Donbass to join NATO. They're fighting to remain a sovereign country, to choose their own destiny, to be a free country, free from Russian oppression. And so I think that, many Ukrainians see this as an existential fight, a fight that their, fathers and forefathers have been fighting for generations during the Soviet period and in the 90s to get rid of this Russian malign influence over their society. And so I have no doubt, based on what I've seen, that if the Ukrainian regular military is defeated on the field of battle, the Ukrainian nation will step up and continue the fight. My 57-year-old father-in-law has vowed to take up arms and fight. He's a former Soviet Army soldier, and he's going to fight against Russians if they come into their hometown. So I have no doubt that the Ukrainian nation is prepared to wage an insurgency. That said, however, insurgencies aren't things that happen overnight. You don't flip on a switch and suddenly have an insurgency ready to rock. So I think that would take time. And I think that, a major Russian attack will likely be extraordinarily violent and fast, and it may inflict such an amount of damage on Ukraine's infrastructure and military that Russia could achieve its goals in such a short time that the insurgency wouldn't have time to take root.
Nolan, please stay safe out there, man. We'll have you back. Nolan Peterson, senior editor, Coffee or Die magazine. Clay?
That was fantastic. Thank you, my man.
How's the midterms looking this early? I know it's a little bit at the opening stages of the political battle, but we've also got redistricting underway and the mom revolution at the school board meeting still bearing fruit across the country. Somebody who knows a whole lot about this stuff is our friend Ryan Girdusky. He's the author of They're Not Listening, How the Elites Created a National Populist Revolution. He is watching all this stuff very closely. Also the founder of the 1776 Project PAC. Ryan, good to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the redistricting fight. I keep having friends that watch this stuff very closely who ping me to say, why aren't Republicans willing to take this to the mat the way Democrats are? Is that what's going on here? Are Republicans not willing to actually wield the leverage they have to get the best districting for themselves possible going to the midterms? What are you seeing?
No, that's not exactly the story. I mean, Republicans are getting their clocks clean with redistricting. I mean, Democrats are going to walk into the 2022 cycle with about 15 more seats in their preference than they had in the last election cycle. So it's partially because of the 2018 elections. Let's start with that. The 2018 elections, Republicans got wiped out in governor's elections across the entire Midwest and the Southwest. It really, really, really hurt them. You have states like, New Mexico, which had Governor Susana Martinez in 2010 as their governor with a Republican state house, and now you have all Democrats. Same thing in Nevada, same thing in Illinois, same thing in New York now. All of those states now where the party is able to redistrict have really gutted Republicans' chances of picking up some seats. In New York, for example, Republicans are going to lose about 4 seats, or they're going to be less likely to keep 4 seats in a state where they didn't have, that many compared to Democrats to begin with. Republicans have tried in states like Tennessee, for example. They gutted one of the 2 Republican seats. In Georgia, they were very aggressive. In Texas, they were very aggressive in their redistricting. The problem is the courts have been striking them down in states like Ohio and North Carolina. Other states where Republicans were very aggressively redistricting, in North Carolina's case, it was a Democrat majority court. In Ohio, it was a Republican majority court who struck them down. And the courts have not been holding Democrats to the same account. In New Jersey, for example, Jersey has an extremely aggressive Democrat gerrymandered state. And I mean, in some of the places, districts are connected by water. They're not even connected by land masses. And they still kept the court upheld the Democrat redistricting effort. So it's been because of the courts have been striking down Republicans, and also in the quote unquote nonpartisan redistricting, it's very clearly favored Democrats in the cases of, California, for example, where Republicans are, some incumbent Republicans are having a very, very tough time.
So early on, the argument was that Republicans were going to gain a lot from redistricting. Obviously, that has not been the case as you are laying it out here. What would be your forecast for what is likely to happen in the House now that we kind of have a sense, at least somewhat, of what these districts are going to look like nationwide? What would be your over-under estimate for Republican pickup, and what chance would you even give for Democrats to be able to hold on, keep Nancy Pelosi in power in the House?
Well, so there are a bunch of big states that have still not presented their maps. Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Those are the big ones especially. They still don't have their maps present. So we don't know, about 100 some odd seats are still out. With the seats that we know that we have, I would say Republicans have probably a 75 to 80% chance of winning back the House. It's looking like it's going to be, as of right now, as of today, it's an R+4 map. That's what the Democrat internals say. That's what the median public polls are all showing. Republicans, right? So last year it was about a D+7 map nationally. It's looking like an R+4 map.
So it's a monster swing, like a double-digit swing from a -7 to a +4 if you're a Republican.
Right. It's a gigantic swing, and it puts Democrats in a position of weakness in places, even like in Connecticut, even in Nevada, in some places, even in parts of California. And Joe Biden is a giant drag on the party right now. The LA Times Berkeley poll in California, just of California, came out with their estimate today saying Joe Biden has a 47% approval rating in the state of California. This is a state he won by 30 points just a year ago. Kamala Harris has a 38% approval rating. Only 60% of Democrats and 30% of independents have a favorable opinion of Kamala Harris at this point. Now, that doesn't mean Democrats are going to start voting in mass for Republicans, but what it does show is that they may not vote at all, which was the case in several of these states. Like in New Jersey last year, when we had the governor's election, Republicans barely lost the governor's election, but they had the biggest swing of the state legislative elections in 30 years. Just yesterday, last night, you had in San Francisco all 3 liberal progressive school board members be kicked out, And in New Jersey, you had Republicans win city council races in New Jersey in very, very blue areas because Republican turnout is going to be closer towards a presidential election, while Democrat turnout will not be nearly as high, which will absolutely be what saves a lot of Republicans who will find themselves, because of redistricting, in bluer districts. So right now, I would say Republicans have a very good chance of picking up seats across the board, and are looking at, if they win the House, probably with a 230 to 240 seat majority, which is a comfortable majority. It's not huge, but I will say this, which is the most important thing: a lot of Republicans come next year will be representing seats that Biden won. So expect a lot more moderation coming from Republicans, simply because they'll be representing districts that voted against Trump in 2020. So the party will be bigger, but it will probably be a lot more moderate than previous 2010 Tea Party wave elections, simply because they won't be representing seats that went for the president. They'll just be representing more moderate or independent-leaning areas.
We're speaking to Ryan Girdusky, author of They're Not Listening and founder of the 1776 Project PAC. Ryan, what do you think, if you were to line up just 2 or 3 messaging points for the GOP at the national level going into this midterms, between now and when the votes are cast? You look at the data day in and day out. You follow very closely the competitive races. What is the secret sauce, so to speak? What's the magic combo? What should Republicans be hammering between now and Election Day?
Right. So I'm writing actually a thing about this for my National Populist Substack, the National Populist newsletter on Substack. This is the perfect time for what Trump campaigned on in 2016. Think about this. You have massive runaway inflation, which is the secret tax and the weakening of the dollar on the working class population. You have now year 3 of the pandemic. Most products that they claimed that were going to be made in America are still not made in America. Most of our medical supplies, our military supplies, essential services that the American public really desperately wants. It came out just 2 days ago that China never reneged on their promise with President Trump to buy $200 billion more of American products. That never happened. And lastly, the border and immigration are a complete disaster area. A new Gallup poll found that 70% of Republicans want to reduce legal immigration, legal, not illegal, and illegal immigration is the number one issue driving Republican voters. If you want your base to turn out, you need to emphasize all of those things. It has to be a message of economic populism and nationalism when it comes to immigration. That is the message to hammer home. That is what delivered Donald Trump his election in 2016. You can say it without being inflammatory, but this is the message that people are genuinely concerned about. People at this point, with new variants and new strains threatening to lock them down again, they are more hesitant towards mass immigration than ever, and they are sitting there and saying, we are the country that defeated the Nazis and the communists in the last century. Why can we still not produce ventilators in this country? Why are we dependent on Mexico for our military equipment? This is a gigantic national security and economic issue. This is the issue to lean into. And if I was also a Republican, I would say lean away from issues of promising to curb Medicare and Social Security. It is the one issue, really, that Republicans are still losing to Democrats on, is the fear from seniors that they're going to cut entitlements. And lastly, but not leastly, of course, critical race theory and schools. It is the biggest wedge issue for suburban moms, the people who hated Donald Trump, but they look at their children right now and the indoctrination and the mask mandates and the school shutdowns, and they are furious about it. And they are blaming it on the Democratic Party, which has been pro-masking and pro-shutdowns for 2 straight years.
Good stuff. Ryan Girdusky giving you a roadmap right there. Thanks for the update on redistricting. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
We bring in now Sara Carter, who has been on the ground in Canada a great deal. I have watched many of her broadcasts, some of them while I'm waiting to be a guest on the same Fox News shows. So we bring in Sara now, and I appreciate you making the time, Sara. First question for you. Yeah. What are these people like? What is it like to be among them? What is the vibe? How would you describe them? who would you compare them to in the United States? You've been on the ground there with them. Take us into that experience.
I would compare them to my own family, hardworking Americans, hardworking Canadians. I met French Canadian farmers, the kind of guys you meet that spend their whole day out in the field working on the farmland with their own hands, truckers who deliver the food to our businesses, the people that we entrust to ensure that we get our products delivered to our stores. These are hard-working, good people. I was there with them. I was never worried about my safety with them. They were so kind. In fact, I spent some time outside of Ottawa, and I went to kind of like their home base, and it was about maybe 20 minutes outside of Ottawa. They had set up a tent on some farmland, and it was just incredible to watch them. You had truckers getting up at 5 a.m. and cooking breakfast for all the other truckers. The families were there supporting each other. So some of them had their children there. They even had like a little barber shop set up. I mean, these are just good, hardworking people that want to be heard. And I think much like Americans felt, Clay and Buck, much like Americans felt when Hillary Clinton called everyone deplorables that supported President Trump. I think the Canadians feel the same way. They feel like Trudeau was an elitist. They called him a tyrant. I've got grandmothers sending me emails this morning, several different grandmothers, believe it or not, and one that just told me, I'm a grandmother from British Columbia, Canada. She has a son who's a trucker, and she said, there are children in the convoy, and now, Trudeau they're hearing he's threatening to use tear gas on them or possibly even an LRAD machine. I guess it's a loud noise machine in an effort to try to get them off the streets and stop them from their protests. And, people are frustrated. They're angry. They're frustrated, but they're peaceful. And this is the difference. They are peaceful. They're not destroying businesses, physically. They are standing their ground, and they have left the roadways open for incoming traffic and outgoing traffic. And I think that's something that we need to be very clear here with, is that they're standing their ground, but they are doing their best to not disturb or harm the businesses around, much like I think Trudeau's harmed the businesses with his stringent COVID mandates.
Speaking of Sara Carter of Fox News, investigative journalist, Sara, you've actually been on the front lines of conflicts and insurgencies. You were in Afghanistan
Correct.
for a long period of time and have done the kind of reporting that people actually think of when journalists are talking about how they're bringing the truth to the people. When you see the Trudeau government referring to the people that you spent time with, that you were talking to, that you were reporting on, and bringing ground truth in this conversation to everybody listening about, when the Trudeau government makes it sound like they're domestic terrorists, they're white nationalists, neo-Nazis, what is your response to that?
Well, it's pretty incredible. I did not run into any white nationalists. I didn't run into any racists. I did run into people from all over the world and from people that came from all over the world, much like people immigrate to America for democracy and freedom. While I was there, I ran into a gentleman. He said, I'm African-Cuban, and I'm out here, and I guess I'm part of Trudeau's fringe. And he couldn't believe it when he heard me speaking Spanish. And I said, I'm half Cuban, and we started chatting. And I asked him about that. I said, have you been getting any, pushback from any of the truckers? Is there, any concern here about racism? And he said, absolutely not. He said, my wife is white. We're here with the truckers. We've been here since the beginning. We're all one big family. I met people from Iraq. I met a rabbi was out there saying some prayers for everyone. So these remarks that are coming from Trudeau are flat on their face lies, because he's generalizing that the entire population of truckers that are there, the entire population, these are the people that he is supposed to be working for, the hardworking men and women of Canada, and the families who all they want to do is be heard. Look, a lot of people have lost their businesses. I met with a businessman. He and his wife owned a restaurant because they wouldn't card people at the front of their restaurant for their vaccination records. The government went in, they took them out of their restaurant, shut their restaurant down, boarded it up, took everything away from them. And they were standing out there with the truckers. I met people who told me that their family members, despite the fact that they had all been vaccinated, couldn't go into a hospital to support their daughter going through chemotherapy or couldn't even visit her because of the stringent COVID mandates. Here's a family that's all been vaccinated. So I think what this is people, not just in Canada, but all over the world saying, look, enough's enough. The governments have reached far too much into our lives, into our personal lives. They want to control our bodies. And now you can see what's happening in Canada. They've taken control of bank accounts. They're planning on seizing their trucks and taking away their businesses and taking away their livelihoods. And they're doing it under these extraordinary measures that have basically given the government carte blanche on all of the people and all of the laws. And so now, what are the Canadians supposed to do? Who are they supposed to turn to? And I've talked to them today. I talked to some last night as well. They say they are not moving. They will not move. They're demanding that those mandates be lifted, and they're demanding to talk to Trudeau, although some of them believe that it's already too late, that Trudeau is far beyond doing anything different than what he's already doing, which is lowering the hammer on them.
Sara, having been there, Buck and I were talking about this earlier in the show. What do you think will happen if the military or if authority figures, armed certainly, try to go in there to clear out the truckers? Will it get violent? What kind of scene do you expect to see based on your experience there?
Based on my experience in Canada, I think what I expect to see, and I did ask that question to many of the people that were there, and we can't always gauge what's going to happen, right? We can't always gauge what kind of event would cause things to turn terrible in an incident of violence. But what I have been told is that they are just going to stand their ground and they are going to make a statement. And Trudeau is going to come out over. He's already the bad guy here, right? Publicly, I think he has shown what the Canadian government has done during this protest, as people calling him a tyrant, people not want. I mean, they say this is the end of Trudeau's career. It's over for him now. We'll see about that. But I really believe that the people are going to hold their ground, and it's going to make Trudeau and the government of Canada look far worse. Look, they're going to have to literally lift those people off the ground and carry them to be arrested. They're going to have to drag them away, and then they're going to have to seize their trucks. How will Trudeau explain that to all the families and all of the people there? And let me remind you, there are a lot of children there that are going to be dragged. Their parents are going to be dragged away, and they never even had an opportunity to really voice their concerns to their own government. What they have had is the opportunity to stand up to, I believe, tyrannical behavior all over the world.
Sara,
And they're teaching other people a lesson, and that's why we're seeing people in Vienna showing up with trucks, and the situation in Australia right now, and we're seeing things happen all over the world right now, and actual convoys here in the United States that are planning to start at the first week of March.
Sara, is there a sense from the truckers that not only is it their intention to hold out until the tyrannical mandates go away, but are they aware of the fact that there are some? We had Jordan Peterson on the show earlier this week, and you obviously, I know you know Jordan, Sara, and what he represents, right, and the kind of political mind that he has. He thinks this could bring down the Trudeau government. Are the truckers aware that that could happen? Was there any discussion of that?
Yeah, they absolutely. There was discussion of that. In fact, that came up quite often, and they do believe that this will be the end of the Trudeau government. They will not take this anymore. And I'm putting it this way, because it's not just about the mandates. You brought it up yourself. These accusations that have, basically, calling these truckers racist, misogynist, these lies that have been perpetuated in the media by Trudeau himself. And people aren't buying it anymore. And what kind of quality of a leader do you have in a nation when your leader goes against the people that do the toughest job, that have the hardest work? Some of these people have been sitting there for weeks now, out in farm fields that are filled with mud and rain and slush and snow. And they've had to come up with all kinds of ingenious ways to continue operating their vehicles. When they tried taking their gas tanks and all of the gas that was being supplied to keep the trucks running in Ottawa, the people in Ottawa started coming out. I mean, they had so many citizens that weren't truckers, and everyone started carrying gas cans by the police and decorating them like purses and putting water in them. And so that the police didn't know if they were picking up a gas can with water or a gas can that was just decorated like a purse. And they had kind of they built kind of an underground gas can railway, there so that they could keep their trucks running. So the people mean business. I think it's spreading across Canada. I think we're seeing the reflection of, once again, the working class standing up and saying, I need you to listen to me. This is over. We're not going to put up with these mandates anymore. We're not going to allow this to go any further. And I think they're really concerned. Trudeau talks a lot about the economy and stopping the economy. But I can tell you this. It was so blatantly obvious that the economy in Ottawa wasn't suffering because of the truckers. The economy in Alberta wasn't suffering because of the truckers. The economy was suffering and is suffering because of these extreme mandates that have harmed people's businesses, that have taken freedom away from individuals, that have taken freedom from families, and that have really pitted I would call the working class against the elite and government classes. And that's something that we should all be concerned about. And I think we saw what was happening in America. We see now the Democrats, even in Democratic states, backing off from these mandates because I think they see the writing on the wall. Here, the midterms are coming up. For Trudeau, it's going to be the end of his political career.
Sara Carter of Fox News, investigative reporter and journalist. Sara, thank you for your work on this one. We'll talk to you again soon.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thank you.
We are joined now by Dave McCormick. He's a combat veteran, Pennsylvania Senate candidate. Dave is with us right now, and he is a seventh-generation Pennsylvanian, which is pretty impressive. Went to West Point, has been in the business universe for a long time. You had a great "Let's Go Brandon" Super Bowl ad up at your website that did not was not allowed to run elsewhere. And so the first question that I have for you, and thanks for taking the time with us, Dave, what made you decide? You're highly successful in the world of business. You've been influential in so many different ways. I know you were a big Trump supporter. What made you decide to step off of the sidelines and run for the Senate in Pennsylvania? What was ultimately the tipping point for you?
Hey, Clay, thanks for having me on. It's great to be with you. I think the big driver of this was this sentiment I tried to capture in the ad, which is I believe the country is really headed in a terrible direction, and it's a combination of the weakness that we see in our policies, 40-year high inflation due to the socialist policies of the Biden administration, which is really hurting working families. We see it in our open border, where the numbers, I was just at the border last week, the numbers coming across our border of illegal immigrants is staggering, but it's having huge consequences for Pennsylvania, where fentanyl is on the rise. We have our sanctuary city of Philadelphia, all-time high in murder rate. And we see it in the energy policy, which is really killing Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is one of the great energy resources of the world. If it was a country, it'd be the fourth biggest reserves in natural gas. And frankly, we see it in our culture, in our schools, the cancel culture, the inability to sort of have a teaching of history, anything like the history of America that I know, the exceptional America. So I'm looking at that, and Afghanistan was the breaking point for me, that tragedy. And my wife and I, who have both lived the American dream, said, we're going to jump in. And it's a time for all patriots to ask themselves what they can do to make sure we save our country and push back against this weakness that we're seeing across our leadership. So that's the reason behind it.
Dave, it's Buck. Thanks for being with us. We see a number of places across the country. We've been following the stories very closely of parents showing up at school board meetings, sometimes with viral videos. Generally, they're outraged about, CDC mask and school masking policies, I should say, CRT being taught in schools, the school shutdowns. How has that been playing out in Pennsylvania? Clay and I talk about the mom revolt, which includes dads too, but the mom's revolt feels like that's the more fierce tip of the spear part of it in some ways. Are you having a similar moment where it feels like there could be real energy from parents that will change the political trajectory in Pennsylvania and maybe have ramifications beyond that?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I mean, at a big picture level, I think what you see is a difference between two big ideas. The ideas that are being promoted by Biden and his administration, which is the government should play a big role in our lives and should decide really important things to our future. And the ideas that we as conservatives believe in, which is it's about individual freedom and individual responsibilities. And there's nowhere that's more clear than in our schools, where you see these mask mandates and the testing mandates and vaccines and so forth being dictated by government and by school officials or state officials as opposed to parents. And it's a complete, it's a complete distortion of what our country was based on in terms of the emphasis. And nobody knows better about what should be taught in our schools and the decisions around our children than our parents. And so I see it. I hear it. It doesn't matter whether it's Democrats or Republicans. It doesn't matter whether it's the Republicans in the outskirts of Philadelphia or the Republicans in the center of the state. It's a big issue, and it's reflective of a broader push by the Democrats to have government play a much more intrusive role in our lives.
We're talking to Dave McCormick, Pennsylvania Senate candidate in the Republican primary coming up. And Dave, I know you've worked in business for much of your life, in addition to the fact that you went to West Point and served in the military. I'm curious how often in your conversations, and I bet it's often, you would talk to people involved in business who would say, man, because of the mob-like social media environment out there, our companies put out statements that I personally, meaning the CEO or someone running those companies, don't agree with, but we feel like we have to do it, otherwise we end up being a target. How often would you hear leaders of companies saying things like that privately that they wouldn't say publicly?
Well, it's been a growing trend, and you see the push over the recent last 3 or 4 years, where there's much more of a focus on social issues within our business community. And the best example of this, which I'd point you to, is Business Roundtable made a statement a couple years ago that a number of CEOs signed about stakeholder capitalism. And it talked about all the different things that companies should be doing. And it really took on a much broader social agenda and involving CEOs in politics. And I think this is a trend across our country. And I think it's really a terrible trend, because companies become political actors. Our military leaders become political actors. And there is this drumbeat of pressure to take on these other priorities as the responsibility of business. And I think we need to enter that world with great care, because our capitalist system is the envy of the world. It's the reason we're the most prosperous country in the world, the most dynamic country in the world. And we need to have our businesses focused on business and generating profit and serving their workers and employees in an excellent way.
Dave, thanks so much for being with us here. Dave McCormick, he's running for Senate in Pennsylvania. Sir, appreciate your time. We'll talk to you again soon.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
We're joined now by Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. Senator, thanks for being with us.
Well, guys, glad to be here.
You're a border state, just a different border, and not too far from the state that you represent, Senator. You've got a situation unfolding right now with the Trudeau government calling in for the police to just start making all the arrests of the trucker convoy. This comes after the news broke that they were seizing people's bank accounts, as well as some of the Democrat corporate media were naming and shaming people after a hack of those who had tried to donate money. What do you make of all this, especially given that this might be the day of all of it coming to an end?
Well, you're right. We are a border state. We kind of speak semi-Canadian-A. But there's such a simple solution here. Why don't they just respect their freedom and their personal health autonomy? I mean, it doesn't have to come down to police cracking down to turning Canada into a totalitarian state. Just respect people's freedom. This just blows me away. Our response to COVID has just been insane. I was listening to you earlier in the hour. There's so much about how we respond to COVID that makes no sense, and this is just the latest example. Just acknowledge their freedom, their personal health autonomy, and let them live their lives. I mean, particularly truckers. They work alone. They're not in contact with too many people. They're not a danger to anybody. This is just bizarre what's happening in Canada, and I am 100% behind the freedom fighters, those Canadian truckers in Canada, and anybody who's willing to fight for freedom.
Senator Johnson, I don't know if you've paid attention to the story that came out of Louisville about the BLM member who tried to assassinate a mayoral candidate in Louisville. The reason why I'm bringing it up with you in particular is in Kenosha, we saw Kyle Rittenhouse not allowed to raise money for his own defense, even though obviously a jury, thankfully, saw the evidence and said that was legitimate self-defense. Should we have a real investigation into these crowdfunding platforms and the choices that they make, because they allowed BLM to raise $100,000 and bail out this guy who tried to assassinate a mayoral candidate in Louisville? We're seeing what happens with them in Canada. Obviously, that's a different country. But to me, what they've tried to do and what they are doing in terms of the way that they're using their platform is crying out for an investigation from the government into how they are applying their policies in what would otherwise seem to be very similar situations where people are trying to raise money to be able to provide the best defense in a criminal context.
You're not saying there's a double standard, are you? Again, I was listening earlier, and you're exactly right. What keeps our financial system together is just confidence. You have to have confidence that if you deposit something in a bank and it gets turned into digital bits, that when you go back and need that money, you're going to get that cash back, or those digital bits aren't just going to disappear. So, these platforms that are, these GoFundMe and those types of things that now people don't have the confidence that if they deposit money for a particular cause, I think they're slitting their own throats, quite honestly. But, I'm happy to investigate all this stuff, but guys, we are faced with double standard after double standard, whether we're talking about, the Russian collusion hoax and the way the press is not covering the Michael Sussman indictment, whether we're just talking about so many things, there's a huge double standard, but we're up against people that have the power to maintain that double standard. We have the truth on our side. We have policies that actually work to maintain freedom and create opportunity. But they've got the power of the media, of the big tech, social media, those giants. We, as conservatives, we are facing many, many challenges.
We're speaking to Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. And Senator, I mentioned that it is true you're a border state, of course, with Canada. But every state in the era of the Biden administration, in a sense, becomes a border state because of the wide open southern border that we currently have. DHS just reported earlier this week 153,941 migrant encounters, apprehensions in January. That is about double what it was in January of 2021, quadruple what it was in January of 2020. And DHS reported that just for the month of January alone, 62,573 migrants who entered illegally were released into the interior of the United States with no real tracking mechanism or anything else going on there. How is this sustainable? They had the worst year ever for illegal immigration in this country last year on Biden's watch. They're advocating in so many ways, it seems, for illegals to come into the United States. And the American people, is it just they're hoping that we don't pay attention, we don't notice? Because it's probably going to be worse this year, Senator.
Well, it's sustainable because the mainstream media is covering up for Joe Biden. But you use the word they're using now, encounter. It always used to be apprehension, but they've gotten so efficient at basically encountering somebody, processing them, and distributing them all over the country. They're actually using the correct term, encounters. Last year's about over 2 million encounters. They did return about 1.1 million people due to the COVID restrictions, but they in terms of who they processed and dispersed, plus the 344,000 known gotaways, there's about 1.25 million people that somehow got in this country illegally. They're not documented. We don't know where they are. But to put that in perspective, guys, that's a number that's larger than the population in 8 states. But that's the extent of this problem. And, of course, we don't talk about the human depredations of the human trafficking, the sex trafficking, the drug trafficking, 100,000 overdoses. How about the gang members that are getting in? MS-13 and other just vicious gangs. The news media, let's face it, they got their candidate elected, even though he's campaigning from a basement. They got Biden elected. Now they're going to cover up for all the disasters that his policies are creating for Americans. But again, I'm somewhat hopeful that they really can't hide 7.5% inflation, rising gas prices, the rising crime, brought about by their low bail policies, their defund police. They can't hide that from the people that are devastated from the results of their policies.
Senator Johnson, what did you think of the Durham revelations and of the fact, and this is not going to surprise you, I know, but how quickly many in the quote-unquote mainstream media ran to help cover for Hillary Clinton? She emerged and made her speech and claimed it's the fevered dream of Fox News deplorables, basically. What do you think about the significance of what has been laid out so far, and where are we headed as it pertains to the Clinton apparatus spying on President Trump?
Well, first of all, it is just Exhibit A of the double standard, the grotesque double standard of the media, and how literally we don't have journalists in the mainstream media. We have advocates, and they're advocates for the Democrat Party. But it's really confirming what I always suspected. We uncovered the Lisa Page, Peter Strzok text, and I made those things public. And the email or the text that I always used to highlight, still do, was written by Strzok to Page in December 2016, between the election and the inauguration of Trump. And it said, "Think our sisters are leaking like mad. Scorned and worried and political, they're kicking into overdrive." Now, what did Peter Strzok know they were worried about? Could it be, their involvement in the wrongdoings in the 2016 campaign, the Russian hoax, the Steele dossier that was Russian disinformation, which they knew as early as October 2016? Could it be they knew about Michael Sussman and what he was doing with highly sensitive government contracts to allow them to track the internet traffic from Trump Tower, as well as then later on the executive office of the president? I've always felt that the Russian hoax was an intelligence community, and Buck, you're from the CIA. They're good at this. This is a diversionary operation on the part of people in the intelligence community. Now, remember when you had 50 intelligence agency professionals come out and say, "Oh, that disk drive, that's Russian disinformation." They had no evidence of that. It's just all part of the diversionary operation. That's what I'm thoroughly convinced about, and I think that's really what the John Durham indictments are showing. I just hope he's gotten his hands on a lot more evidence than we were able to get our hands a hold of from the FBI, even though we subpoenaed Christopher Wray. So he's got to reveal all this. Merrick Garland has to make his entire report public. Gina Haspel, here's an example. Chuck Grassley and I wrote a letter just kind of laying out all the information we needed from the CIA. This was in June of 2020. We couldn't even get her to give us a phone call to tell us why she wasn't responding to our legitimate congressional oversight request. That's the contempt that these people have for the American public, the contempt they hold for the people's elected representatives. Now, this is an enormous scandal, and the silence in the mainstream media is deafening, but it's very revealing.
Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. Senator, always appreciate you coming by to hang out with us. Thank you, sir.
Have a great day. Stay well.
We bring in now, she wrote a fantastic op-ed piece. She is Hannah E. Meyers, Director of Policing and Public Safety at the Manhattan Institute. And she recently wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that said these policies were supposed to help black people. They're backfiring. It is up right now at clayandbuck.com. You can also go read that at the New York Times. Hannah, appreciate you taking the time to join us here. It's a fascinating piece, and it's one that is hardly being analyzed at all. What are the impacts, as you found them and saw them, of the Black Lives Matter movement and what has happened in their wake?
Thank you, Clay. And this is more broad than Black Lives Matter, but certainly a lot of overlap with what their policy goals were. We look at criminal justice reforms over the past few years, and we're here in New York, so we focus on our 2019 statewide bail reform and discovery reform. We look at the Less is More Act that passed just this last September that has fewer parole violators in jail. And also we look at policies since around 2016 in New York City that have gradually and intentionally decreased the number of people held in jail on a variety of crimes. And what we find is these reforms were put in place very explicitly to improve Black lives, to reduce the amount of interaction between Black New Yorkers and the criminal justice system. And what we find is, looking at the data, any which way, you see that these policies have actually contributed to making Black lives much harder and actually increasing the amount of interaction between Blacks and the criminal justice system, the extent to which they're touched by the criminal justice system. And this is both by contributing to an enormous increase in violent crime that impacts Black New Yorkers more than anyone else. If you look at 2020, murders went up citywide a horrific 41%. Shootings about doubled. But if you look at a neighborhood like Brownsville, Brooklyn, that is predominantly Black, you see that murders went up over 127%, and shootings went up 191%, which is unthinkable. But violent crime very disproportionately victimizes Black New Yorkers, who make up only about 24% of the city. And similarly, the goal of decreasing the extent to which Blacks are arrested, convicted, incarcerated, has had the opposite effect. If you look at, for instance, the inmate population at New York City's Rikers Island Jail, about 5 years ago, it was about 50% Black. Now it's 60% Black. All of this pointing to the reality that criminal justice policies, for everyone's sake, but even to a greater extent for the sake of Black New Yorkers, should be based upon the goals of public safety, law and order, and not around trying to engineer particular racial outcomes.
Hannah, it's Buck, and I wanted to dig into that a bit some more. I mean, this piece was,
Sure.
I think, so well written and brought together so many important pieces of data. You wrote in it, this strategy is harming Black New Yorkers by aiming for racial equity in criminal justice rather than focusing solely on deterring and responding to crime. Policymakers seem to have neglected the foundational purpose of law and order. What has followed, a sharp rise in victims of crime who remain disproportionately Black and a slight increase in the percentage of Rikers Island inmates, you just mentioned that, is a racial imbalance of a more troubling kind. End quote there. So the social justice movement, which we often hear of in the context of criminal justice as criminal justice reform, they explicitly claim, and this is part of your research, what you find, that because there is a disproportionate number of, or there are disproportionate numbers of members of the Black community in prison, the system is racist, and therefore we have to change the system. Is that a fair assessment of what they're pushing for? Correct.
And what we argue instead is that this is not a criminal justice. This is not something you can correct with criminal justice policy. This is a much broader issue. In New York City, pretty consistently, shooting victims are about 71% Black. Again, the city residents are about 24% Black. Murder victims are about 65% Black. And crime is very intra-racial, especially violent crime. So shooting suspects are about 71% Black. Murder suspects and arrestees are about 65% Black. And this isn't something, you can't dismantle the criminal justice system to try to correct for why this is happening. And in fact, when you do, you only hurt the same communities that are the main victims of these crimes, and that when you stop incarcerating people and prosecuting them for crimes, these are the communities that they are returning to and victimizing people, and you are in fact hurting the population you're trying to help by creating, streets that aren't safe for kids to go to school, businesses that suffer by having a greater degree of disorder and crime. And so even if you don't foundationally believe, as I think you and I do, that criminal justice policy in all fairness and rightness should just be based on who's committing crime, even if you are setting out very explicitly to improve the lot of Blacks relative to others in New York, it's just the wrong way to go to do that. You're much better off by just trying to ensure public safety for everybody and letting the chips fall in who that ends up arresting and convicting and incarcerating, as long as those are the people whose actions have landed them, for whom those are the consequences.
Hannah, so much of media attention, I'm glad you brought that up, is focused on one race perpetrating a crime against another race. That is a very substantially minority act. As you said, most racial crime, or most crime, I should say, is within the same race, right? So a black person is likely to victimize a black person, white and white, Asian and Asian, Hispanic and Hispanic. That goes across the board. Why do you think, this is a couple of part question here, why do you think the media overwhelmingly focuses on crimes that involve a minority of overall crimes and are external in nature, right, outside of the race? And a second part of that, even to write this piece and or discuss it, I'm assuming that you are in some sense terrified that you're going to be called racist for sharing actual facts and data, even though, again, they're actual facts and data. How much does the fear of racism keep legitimate conversations like this from taking place?
So I think there's a lot of nuance there. I think in the past few years, many people have very genuinely been concerned about the extent to which blacks are arrested and incarcerated, are involved in crime, or the relationship between police and the black communities, which is inherently fraught because police respond to crime in the neighborhoods that it happens. And as we just discussed, violent crime very disproportionately happens in black neighborhoods, which is why it's so important to build trust and partnership and a sense of community between police and black communities. I think the narrative has gotten incredibly polarized, and I think it's very easy to simply say, well, look at these numbers are so skewed. Obviously, it's a racist system. This is all about the criminal justice system itself. I think also we've had such a reduction in crime in New York City over the past few decades and nationwide. But if you look at New York, where it's particularly stark, where we went from, 22,000 murders, 2,200 murders in around 1990 to 230 murders, something like that a couple years ago, people become very lax about the reality of violent crime. They think you can dismantle. Why should we be prosecuting anyone or arresting anyone? Crime doesn't really happen, and I think it has, the problem has been worse because, there is a population of people like, we were talking about these skewed numbers in New York City, about 1% of shooting victims are white and 1% of shooting arrestees are white, and same for Asian. It's very easy to not grapple with the reality of what it feels like to live to be a potential victim of a shooting, to live in a neighborhood where you're scared to let your kids go out. And I think it's actually made the narrative worse. If you look at, for instance, a Gallup poll in the height, August 2020, when things were really very volatile around this issue, a nationwide Gallup poll found that 81% of Black Americans wanted the same or more amount of police in their neighborhoods. And I think the media narrative, politicians, they have not wanted to accept the reality of people on the ground and their lived experience of crime and victimization and disorder. My own institute did a poll this past fall in the 20 fastest growing cities nationwide that found that a majority of Black residents wanted more policing of quality of life issues like public urination and littering and graffiti. And I think it's very easy to paint this big image of, cops versus Blacks and not accept the reality that Blacks, like everyone else, need police to reduce, to maintain order and peace and allow individuals to thrive. And even if that relationship can be fraught because these numbers are skewed, that has to be something that's built on and upheld and looked at as a partnership, and you can't just dismantle policing and call it racist. And I think
Hannah, we've got about a minute. I just want to ask: Are you seeing? Sure. Hannah? Are you seeing the beginnings, at least, of what feels like the turning of the ship in the other direction? I mean, are you seeing not just New York, but Chicago, Houston's having a really rough year and had a very bad 18 months or so with shootings? San Francisco, Los Angeles. Do they realize that bail reform, not enforcing smaller crimes, not arresting people for shoplifting, not punishing people severely for shootings Are they changing the tune or not so much?
I think there's certainly been more attention to the correlation between cities that have these so-called progressive prosecutors who focus on non-prosecution of crimes, reducing sentencing, reducing charges, and record homicide increases and record shoplifting increases. And whereas prosecution, I think, gets less attention than policing because it feels a little bit more obscure and less something people see with their eyes on the street, I think there is a gaining attention to it, but we need to have a lot more of that, such that policymakers actually feel like they might get not be reelected if they don't change some of the policies that are undermining public safety, prosecution policies.
Hannah Meyers, Director of Policing and Public Safety at the Manhattan Institute. Go to clayandbuck.com to read her latest op-ed from the New York Times. Hannah, my friend, good to have you on. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Right now, we got our friend Ned Ryun, founder of American Majority, coming to us from the front lines of freedom in Northern Virginia, the Loudoun County school throwdown. Ned, good to have you back.
Yeah, good to be back with you guys. Yeah, definitely a good time to be alive and never a dull moment here in Loudoun County.
So what's going on with the mask situation? I know your own kids, they've been out of school for 10 days because they refused to get masked up by these loons?
That's right. No, we talked through with the three older kids the process. If they were not going to show up with a mask, they're going to get suspended. They all wanted to go through it. So they were all formally suspended for refusing to wear masks. And that, of course, ended on Wednesday, not only because Glenn Youngkin signed into law the bill that had been passed to the Senate and the House of Delegates, but because the Loudoun County judge basically did issue an injunction saying that there will be no mask. So everybody went back to school yesterday, without a mask. But even the best thing, Buck, was this. The judge ordered that any disciplinary actions for not obeying the mask mandate be struck from the records of all the students. So it was one of those things where I just told the kids on the way home, we were out somewhere Wednesday night. On the way home, I said, the great thing is, guys, you held in there, you hung in there. And oftentimes what leads to success is holding on when everybody else has let go. So I'm so proud of you guys, and you get to go back to school tomorrow without a mask. So there's been real victory. But I have to tell you, Buck, I'm not really interested in going, we won, we can go back to normal. I don't want to sing Kumbaya with these folks. I'm interested in running out as many school board members as possible and pursuing other means if I think there's an avenue for that as well, because I'm not interested in this happening again, and I want there to be, quite frankly, a little pain and misery for them for what they've done to these kids for way too long.
So you guys won. Congratulations, and most importantly, congratulations to your kids who learned amazingly important lesson about standing up for what's right and getting that validation of now knowing they were right. Is this over in Arlington County and Northern Virginia too? Because I know that they're still trying to appeal, and that thing is still a mess for people out there geographically. Arlington County, right across the river, the Potomac, from Washington, D.C., which obviously has had very draconian COVID restrictions. What's the latest there? Has all of Virginia acquiesced to the power of the governor to make this choice, or what's going on there?
They're fighting. It's Arlington's inside of Fairfax County, and Fairfax has dug in, Clay, and they're refusing to actually suspend masks until March 1st, because legally the law that was passed March 1st is when it goes into effect. And the difference between Fairfax and Loudoun is that judge stepping in Wednesday night, I think it was around 7 o'clock, saying, no, I'm issuing an injunction. But no, Fairfax has doubled down, which is completely absurd and ridiculous, and are basically fighting to the last moment because they refuse to let the kids come back without masks. So I think right now, as things stand, unless there's an injunction issued by a judge in Fairfax County, those kids are not going to be able to go back without masks until March 1st, which is completely ridiculous and absurd. When the law has been passed, it's in effect, but these local school boards have completely lost their minds. They're completely detached from reality. And I reminded my kids, Clay, this has nothing to do with real data or real science. This is an out-of-touch school board really kind of having a power play that we're in charge, and by God, we're not going to let you come back without masks until the very last moment. We are actually forced by law to do that. And the other thing, too, that's not as well known, Clay, is even up until 7 o'clock on Wednesday night, the Loudoun County public school lawyers were fighting tooth and nail to try and get the kids to be the kids that were suspended to not be able to come back until March 1st to force the mask mandate. And the judge finally said at 7 o'clock, no, we've had enough. I'm issuing an injunction. But the Loudoun County School Board and their lawyers were going to fight this to the bitter end as well. So it's pretty amazing, and I hope that we do have the ability to run some of these Loudoun School Board members out this fall with special elections, because the signatures have been collected on at least a couple of them to hopefully be able to force those recall elections this fall.
We're speaking to Ned Ryun, founder of American Majority. And Ned, you know, how much of this, because you've been dealing with this situation in Loudoun County for a while now. It's also been the site of some of these teachers these school board members who don't like being chewed out by parents who are rightfully angry about the situation. But now with this whole, the fact that this is going to court and people spending all this time on the mask thing in schools, when we're seeing masks drop away, mask mandates dropping away in state after state across the country, is this just about political spite? Is it because, let's be honest, the lib education apparatus doesn't want to give an inch to those evil Trumpers who don't like masks? Or are people really, I know it's a combination, but are people really just terrified that if kids can breathe fresh air, they're going to die from COVID? You know, like, what's really pushing this?
I think it's a mix of both, Buck. I think there are still some people that literally still buy into, even though we know that there are studies out there that those stupid paper cloth masks are 10% effective, even N95 masks are only 50% effective if worn correctly, but they've still bought into the lie that somehow this will protect them from this virus. And I think there also is an element of political spite, that they deeply resent that Glenn Youngkin won, that Jason Meyers is the Attorney General, that Republicans now control the House of Delegates. Yeah, so there's certainly an element of bitterness and anger about losing politically, but I think this is going to have serious consequences for them. I mean, not only here in Loudoun, in Virginia, but we saw it in San Francisco. People have had enough. People have said, we're done here. You're not the ones that get to dictate to us how you use our taxpayer dollars, how you teach our kids. Quite frankly, is more they're trying to indoctrinate, but we've had enough. And the
Ned, is Glenn Youngkin the real deal from what you're seeing so far? Because so far, from an outsider's perspective, I don't live in the state, but I'm like, this guy's getting it done.
I've been pleasantly surprised. I have to tell you, I had my question marks that maybe some of this was political expediency, but he's been true to his word. He said, I'm going to be your advocate. I'm going to be your champion. Parents, you're going to have the ability to have more choice and more say in how your children are educated and their health choices when they go to school. And he did not back down. He and Jason Meyers have gone to the mats and said, we promised you we would do this, and we've actually done it. And it's required a little bit of political courage, but he's, unlike a lot of politicians, said, I'm going to do this, and he's actually followed through on his promises.
Ned, this is a perfect example of elections having consequences, because for people out there who are living in different parts of the country and they are saying, hey, my kids are still masked up, we still don't have the freedom as parents to make a choice for our own kids. You guys proved change one office, and I know the AG and also the lieutenant governor changed, but that changed everything when it comes to masks. Like, it's upsetting that Fairfax is trying to hold out until March 1st, but if Terry McAuliffe wins this election, you're finishing the school year with all your kids in masks.
Oh, at a minimum, but even more so, Clay, the fact that elections have consequences. The reason we were able to get this pulled off, House of Delegates flipped 7 seats. Now it's a 52-48 Republican majority, and they were able to get this through. I think the pleasant surprise was the fact that the state Senate, which is Democrat majority 21-19, actually passed through SB 739, this bill that actually lifts the mask mandates. But yeah, elections have consequences. We won the governorship, we won the attorney general, we won the lieutenant governor, we won the House of Delegates in a state that Biden won by 10 points in 2020. These things have consequences that impact our daily lives, and that's why I'm telling people, you better focus on this fall from school board all the way to federal, and if we do it right, I think we will be very, very pleasantly surprised by the impact that we can have. But I want people to really double down and say, you know what, even though we've won in this mask mandate situation in the short term, I want there to be more permanent victories. We have to take over more school boards to say we're never going to let this happen again.
Our friend Ned Ryun, he is the founder of American Majority. And also the author of The Adversaries, a story of Boston and Bunker Hill, which you can all pick up for some weekend reading. Ned, thanks for being with us, my friend.
I appreciate it, guys. Thank you.